So we're now here with two recent FDA approvals of CAR T-cell products for patients with relapsed lymphoma, and that's the axicabtagene ciloleucel and the tisagenlecleucel. What are the FDA-approved indications for these therapies?
So right now it's in the relapsed refractory diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, those patients who have failed or been refractory to 2 prior lines of therapy. There is the inclusion of patients who have had transformed lymphoma, so an indolent lymphoma like follicular lymphoma that then has progressed to a diffuse large B-cell lymphoma in this population.
And I would also add to that that we've now included those criteria in the NCCN guidelines for B-cell lymphoma. So CARs in these products are now part of the NCCN algorithm for that group of patients.
So I think both of these agents required 2 prior regimens, right? And a disease after 2 prior regimens to go forward?
Yes, that's right.
So is this an important advance for our patients?
Well, I think it's definitely looks like as the data continues to mature that this is, you know, an option that patients should be considered for. If you're a relapse refractory large cell lymphoma patient and you can't get to transplant, I'm concurrently having the discussion because of the outcomes with second-line therapy. If I have identified a high-risk patient, starting the conversation about CAR T-cell therapy very early. In this, that if the patient isn't chemosensitive to the degree that I would want to take another transplant, that we can pivot to the conversation about CAR T-cell and it's not, you know, a foreign topic to them.
I think one point, David, to your question about the number of prior therapies, if you look at the transformed group of patients in the clinical trials to date, it was required to have 2 therapies, including an adriamycin-containing regimen for the large cell lymphoma. Whereas there are some patients who had a follicular lymphoma, had adriamycin as part of their regimen, then relapsed or transformed. And there's still a question, and in the NCCN guidelines, we're kind of silent on whether the adriamycin has to be for the aggressive lymphoma, or there would have to be 2 regimens for the aggressive lymphoma, or an aggressive one for follicular plus a different one for large cell. So
yeah, I think it's a hard question because it's really an individualized patient discussion, right? Because some people will come in with 4 or 5 prior regimens for their follicular lymphoma and then have their transformational event versus somebody who receives our CHOP frontline and then relapses.
I think it's an area of a lot of controversy because we've clearly had patients with follicular lymphoma that have even had an anthracycline like R-CHOP and failed a transplant and then transform. And then
right.
What do? Your kind of hands are tied and you can't really go down the usual pathway.
But I think we understand that that's a poor risk population and still I think an unmet medical need within lymphoma.
Right. For the trials, those patients would not have been eligible, but I think in the real world and the way the guidelines are written, I think they may be.
So we have a third contender that's in late stage clinical development. That's the lisocabtagene maraleucel. Dr. Gordon, you're an investigator on that trial as well?
Yes, and the Transcend study, the JCAR-17, is now fully accrued the patients for the pivotal trial, and we are expecting at some point submission to the FDA for approval. So that trial is now fully accrued.
All right, so let's review a little bit the clinical data. Dr. Ghosh, can you review the tisagenlecleucel data?
Yes, so the Juliet trial, which looked at tisagenlecleucel in relapsed or refractory diffuse large cell lymphoma after failure of 2 prior therapies, was just reported in the New England Journal of Medicine. The overall response rate was 52% with a CR rate of 40% in this study, and there were 22% patients who had grade 3-4 CRS, and there were, I think, about 12% patients who had grade 3-4 neurologic toxicity. At 1 year, 65% of the patients were relapse-free. So.
And also, we're getting data with the lisocabtagene maraleucel that has been reported at several prior meetings, including this ASH meeting 2018. Dr. Gordon?
Right. Well, it looks like the overall response rates are similar, maybe a little bit higher at about 80%. CR rates were at about 55%, but durable CRs are running in the mid-40s to 50, between 45 and 50% of patients have a durable CR. And it appears that those patients that are in complete remission at a year have a very high chance, maybe 90% or more, of remaining in completion, at least in complete remission, up to about 2 years.
And I think that's what we were seeing with the axicabtagene ciloleucel as well, because we were now having 2-year data, or a little beyond 2-year data, which is really encouraging, showing a very flat progression-free survival curve where patients are staying in remission, and about 40%, 39 to 40% of patients appear to stay in remission. And of course, the cure word keeps coming up at that point, and we're all very excited about trying to decide whether this will result in long-term progression. Clearly, the axicabtagene ciloleucel data is the most mature, and we're lagging behind in some of the other clinical trials as the lisocabtagene is being developed over time. But I mean, we're really encouraged by these flat progression-free survival curves, and really hoping that this is going to alter the natural history of their disease.
Right. I'm impressed. I mean, there are 2 ways you can be impressed. You can be impressed reading the data and looking at the curves, and you can be impressed actually taking care of these patients. That to me is more meaningful. And you know, we're seeing patients who had multiple treatments, have been refractory, have bulky disease, and at 2 years now, we have data up to 2 years, remain in remission and doing well with a performance status of 0.
I think the other thing which you can note across all three studies is if someone is in a CR at 3 months, it seems like that could be a surrogate for a long-term remission. The drop-off after 3 to 6 months seems to be very small compared to between the first assessment at 1 month and 3 months, and that seems to be a trend across most of the studies. We don't have very long follow-up with the lisocabtagene study yet, but it appears to be the case.